Okay, so the private side is very important to make these clusters tick, so to say. Here.
Yes, definitely. And to my experience, it is the triple helix what we talk about, but it needs to be the companies who are in the driver's seat in actually driving this triple helix.
Okay. And how many clusters have you managed to develop in the region of Upper Austria?
So far, we have developed 9 clusters and networks in the real existing fields of strengths in our region.
Okay. Also building on strengths, as Madeleine said, you have to have some ground for this, not to build it on thin air.
Definitely. I mean, it is an absolute minimum of companies that needs to be in this region. The second thing is you need to have at least a certain value chain and a certain proportion of the value chain, because it makes no sense. I mean, for example, in Austria, we have probably about 3,000 bakery shops, but we do not make a bakery cluster.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, Christian, any comments to this? You heard?
I think it's very interesting to hear the importance of the regional government in getting things started, and actually be curious to both of you, how important is this political support? I mean, we learned that the dynamism really comes from the companies and the institutions in the clusters, but is it important that the politicians at the higher level say, this is an important thing, or is it enough to kind of just fire and forget, do some initial funding, and the rest the private sector and the networks will do for itself?
I think what we found is that the government agencies have a real role in bringing together the different actors that are important for building that cluster, and that initial facilitation and setting the direction. Albeit, I completely agree, it has to be driven by industry, but bringing together all the different parties, that's a real role for government.
Okay.
I also fully agree with that, because it is about setting the stage and setting the structure up front. And when we talk about private-public partnership funding, there is still at least a certain proportion of public funding, and for this you need to have commitment by, in our case, the regional government, that you are doing the right things, and it is about measuring the success of those initiatives. And in our findings, we see that the proportion, what is the industry contributing financially, is also one key indicator of measuring the success of our cluster initiatives.
Okay. Thank you very much. So Christian, let's turn back, and what do you see as the main advantages of this cluster policy, and are there any drawbacks to this, or is it just a good policy and it's happy for everyone, and you get all this dynamics and competitiveness? Or
no, I think there are real advantages, but there are also challenges that we have to be very aware of. Let's start with the advantages, because we do feel that this is a tool that's really too important for governments to ignore. Let's put it that way. At the same time, a lot of the things that we do are not tremendously different from what we've done in innovation policy or other types of policies in the past. So what are really the distinguishing features? I think one of them is really that we are looking at a different object. So in the past, we really looked at either a narrow industry or we looked at an individual company. And what we found is that really created a lot of distortions, and Werner pointed that out. Modern competition doesn't work that way. You really have to look at the entire value chain. Otherwise, you end up working with one part of the value chain, but the value actually migrates to somebody else who really takes the benefits. So that doesn't work. We really need to find a new way of finding what's the right type of object for economic policies. And for that, I think cluster is really a market-driven approach, because it tries to follow what are the type of activities that really work together to create value at the market and really then secure market success. It's not a theoretical construct that people like you and I come up with and say, this is a cluster and that's what you have to follow. It is really market driven. The second point, and again, I think that came out very clearly in the comments by Madeleine and Werner, is it is so important to think about the regional perspective. In the past, we often focused on national policies, and it's still true that a lot of very important decisions are taken at the national level, or in Europe at the EU level. But if you really want to engage and really think about what are the individual factors that drive company success, you have to go down at the region, because that's where it all comes together. That's where things are happening. A university is located in a special place, and you need to think about how do you engage with that locally, not at the national level. So clusters really give regions a new meaning, I think a new mission on what they really do in economic policy that's very different from the past, where I think it was all about, okay, build some roads and basically execute, what the important guys in the capital have come up with. This is a very different approach. Third point, again, we heard it in the discussion, enhancing your own strength. I think in the past we had all these discussions about, let's look at the global market. What are the new markets that are going to develop? Healthcare because of the demographic developments, and of course, environmental technologies and things like that. That's all important, but these are also markets where we have a lot of competitors moving in. You will only succeed if you have some strength to build on. And the clusters provide exactly that perspective. Very different, by the way, from the traditional thinking in strategic industrial policy or strategic trade policy, where you only look at the generic attractiveness of an industry, which basically led every country and region to move into the same kind of areas, IT and biotech. And then, both our guests really talked about this public-private dialogue, and that is, I think, really important. What we need is not just smarter government, but what we need is almost smarter consumers of government economic policy. We want companies to be able to tell the government, okay, we understand there are trade-offs. You can't give us tax rebates, better infrastructure, better schools, and innovation support at the same time. Doesn't work. But we can help you to really figure out what has the highest impact on us as companies. And so that's the new type of dialogue. We get a much more informed conversation between companies and the public sector, rather than the old one about liberalize the labor market and lower taxes, which might be important, but that's not the whole story. There is a platform that is being created by clusters for this type of public-private collaboration. I think that's really crucial and sets this type of policies apart from older ones. At the heart of it is really a focus on productivity. I think whenever I look at cluster programs, I really try to figure out, okay, if there is government money flowing, is it actually increasing the productivity or innovative capacity of companies? It's not about market share or just about the jobs created. That's important, but that will happen only if there is higher productivity. So cluster policy is really changing our focus in the way that we think about different policy instruments. Now that's the good story, But then I think we have to be very open, really talking about what are the challenges that are ahead of us. And there are some more conceptual challenges, and there are some more practical challenges about how do we do the things. One of the conceptual issues is that we know that strong clusters thrive on this combination of competition and collaboration. That was one of the themes of the first program in this series. If we're true to ourselves, we have to admit that government policy only works for collaboration. And so we need to make sure that we don't forget the competition part. So we still need to focus on the internal market in Europe. We need to make sure that there is an openness and companies are fully exposed to the market pressure, especially if they get support through cluster networks. So I think that's a balance that's not very easy to kind of adjust the right way. Second issue, I think, has to do with scale of the impact. And it'd be interesting from both of you to maybe hear on that as well. What we see is a lot of well-functioning cluster initiatives, and if you do evaluations and talk to the individuals, they're usually happy and say, yeah, it was good for my company, and that's why Werner has companies that are willing to spend money. They get benefits from it. But as a public policy, we need to think about what are the broader benefits. Is this really helping the entire regional economy? Do we see improvements in prosperity? And that's, I think, what we need to work much harder to make sure that the cluster intervention becomes an intervention for the entire economy. That, by the way, is also a huge issue from a political economy standpoint. If you're a regional politician and say, okay, I help the 5% of people employed in this cluster, I don't help the rest, that's a recipe to not be elected again. So we need to find something better. Two further issues, just to add those to the list, that are really hard to deal with. One is, how do we deal with emerging clusters? We know that economies are changing, that there is diversification going on, regions are moving in new areas. But as we heard from both our guests, it's easy to work with established clusters, where you already have strength, you know who to work with. It's essentially about connecting the dots. But what do you do when you see that there is a market opportunity, you have some technological capabilities, maybe 2 or 3 companies that can do this, but this is not enough? How do we work with these type of clusters? And I don't think we have yet the fully specified kind of toolkit for leveraging that.